Welcome to another episode of the Convene podcast. This is News Junkie's weekly overview from the Convene editors. My name is Magdalena Atanasova, digital media editor at Convene, and I'm happy to kick this first review off. So the story that I picked was the leading story in last Thursday's News Junkie. It was from hotelsmac.com, titled How Meeting Planners Are Coping with Higher Costs. And I immediately had to look at the story because it aligned with an article I wrote on a session that took place at Convene in EMEA in this September on the topic of rising costs. So it was a natural pick for me. The author of the story was Raina Katz, and she quickly gave the answer to the challenge hotels, venues, and planners have with tight budgets and rising costs. And her answer was deploying creativity. And I thought, well, that perfectly aligns what panelists Melton and Ott actually highlighted at Convene in EMEA. So it was interesting to see one more confirmation that creativity should be the go-to answer for planners. And the article then touched on costs and the fact that food and beverage is the biggest cost for hotels, but it's an expense that is passed on to planners. And that's a fact that we saw also in the 30th Meetings Market survey that we ran recently and is now available in the November forecast issue. And what really struck me was that she said chefs are having to order food at different intervals for 2024. So they're asking planners for menu selections 45 days out versus 72 hours that they previously allowed, which was very interesting. And she went on to explain the reasons of staffing and overall planning of the menu so that, of course, planners didn't have to really do everything and determine numbers so early, but chefs they need now more time to plan things out. And Katz finished then the article by saying that budgets are generally quite strong. And she was quoting an Amex report that said that 65% of planners are seeing an increase in spend. And funny enough, we saw a similar figure in the Meetings Market survey. We saw 64% of our respondents that also forecasted an increase in budgets. And that doesn't mean that really they don't work hard to make every dollar count. And again, we have to go back to creativity. And I also would like to highlight the fact that over-communicating and asking hard questions, which were two of the suggestions from Convene in EMEA, are really important for meeting planners to consider. So that's kind of my little wrap of News Junkie.
Well, I think the fact that you ended with questions is a really good place for us to start on the next story. I'm Michelle Russell, editor-in-chief of Convene, and the story I picked was from, I think it was Monday's News Junkie, which was from Forbes on a topic that we have written a lot about, which is the fact that women ask far fewer questions in the Q&A session at conferences, mostly academic conferences. And this is based on the latest research. And what I got from that was something I think we all kind of know, which is women hold back from asking questions because they're very concerned about what everybody else thinks about them. So they worry whether they'll be perceived as being too assertive, too self-promoting. They worry about being disliked. And I think this is, for my generation at least, part of the way we were raised was to be pleasers and to make sure people didn't think that we were overstepping. The other thing I thought was really interesting about that article was that women at economics conferences are asked 12% more questions per seminar. And those questions are more patronizing and hostile than men who are presenting are asked. So I think, what does this say for planners? I liked at the end that they talked about the fact that it's really difficult to make these switches because I think it has to do with implicit bias. People aren't, I think, setting out to be hostile to women. I just think that is part of the way everyone has been raised. The question that the Forbes article raised was, how do we make the atmosphere at these conferences more hospitable to women? And I think if we, at the outset, raise the comfort level and the audience has this awareness that we're trying to make this a much more welcoming environment, that would help people feel like they could just ask questions and not feel so worried about what everyone is thinking.
Hi, I'm Barbara Palmer. I'm Convene's deputy editor. When you were talking, Michelle, I was thinking about the structure of asking questions. So often, I think we look at interpersonal reasons for why things are happening, but I think sometimes they're structural. And I would be so interested to know if that research looked at different ways in which questions were asked. That thing where everybody rushes the mic, I don't think you're even getting a good representation of men's questions if the attention always goes to the person who wants to be the first to get their voice out there. And I think one of the things that I think would be so interesting is if people experimented with different ways of asking questions. I know that they take questions that are delivered digitally, but what if groups would come up with questions? Or what if somebody experimented with telling them at the outside, the first 5 questions are going to be women. So, if you want to ask questions, you can hand your paper to somebody. But just thinking about ways to make it easier for people to actually ask questions. It'd be really interesting to experiment with that.
I don't know that in this article they talked about it specifically having the app where you can ask questions from the audience anonymously. They did say, though, that digital events also had a lower number of women who asked questions for virtual events, which surprised me because I thought that if you were in a different environment, you wouldn't feel like all eyes were on you and be so self-conscious. Casey, what do you think?
Casey, I'm Convene's managing editor. This actually reminded me of a story that I wrote back in 2018, which just shows how prevalent this issue is of men kind of feeling like they can assert their voice more than women can. I think a lot of it not only is how questions are structured, but the expectations of gender, male versus female. I spoke with Mark Lipton in 2018, and he's a leadership advisor, and he also wrote a book called Mean Men, The Perversion of America's Self-Made Man. He found that many male leaders were quite assertive, quite angry, quite aggressive. He was hard-pressed to find a woman who displayed those qualities. It was always a male leader. And in your article, Michelle, I noticed, or the article that we're referencing, many women said they feared to speak up because they were afraid people would talk behind their back or they would come across as too assertive, which is exactly what Lipton said when I spoke with him several years ago. Men are always discouraged from acting like a girl. Meanwhile, women don't want to act unladylike or take up too much space.
I think I'm disappointed because I feel like this stuff should have gone away in the later generations, but I see my daughters experiencing it in the workplace. I see my one daughter said that she is continually asked questions by someone who's lower in rank to her. And I said to her, you need to say to him, are you asking me this question because you are interested in learning? Or are you asking this question because you're questioning my judgment? Because what she's feeling is that he is questioning her judgment. So sometimes you can just flip it around and ask them why they're asking the question. Kurt, as the resident male, tell us what you think.
I'm Kurt Wagner. I'm the digital editor, and I was just going to say, as the only male in this group, I'm not defending any pushy men at all. But I think that, like you, Michelle, it's something that I don't understand why it hasn't gone away in the later generations, because it really makes no sense. I mean, part of it has to do with, I was raised by a strong woman who always spoke her mind. But part of it also is that women are so prevalent, especially in this industry. I've had one male boss, I think, in my entire time in journalism. And even above that, they were women. It's not uncommon. It's not odd. So I always find it weird, too, when women say, I'm sorry a lot. And I like my friends who do that and people in professional situations who I know do that. I'm like, don't say you're sorry. There's no reason for you to be sorry for that. Men never say they're sorry because, they misspoke or whatever. There's no reason for you to do that. I can only approach it as a personal thing, and it just always makes me mad. That's my 2 cents, ladies.
I think it's interesting that you bring up industry, though, because I do think it's true that journalism is filled with a lot of strong, outspoken women. And I think we are empowered to do so because there's quite a few of us that are perhaps higher in rank than in some industries and meetings and events as well. It's a very female dominated industry, not necessarily at the top, but in terms of female planners versus male planners, there's certainly a lot of women. But then when you get into the industries that the article is talking about, like economics and science, that's a much more male dominated field, and it might not be as welcoming to diverse points of view.
I was just thinking about the fact that Claudia Golden just was the first woman to win a Nobel in economics. She had been part of a team that won a Nobel earlier, and she really addresses this implicit bias because she was the one that did the research on blind symphony auditions, where they concealed the identity of the musicians auditioning and found great differences in the outcomes. And I was reading an article where they reproduced that in soccer. They were trying to research, women soccer players are paid a lot less or have been globally. And the reasoning is, well, they're not as entertaining. And they blurred the identities of soccer players and found that the female players were ranked as entertaining as the men when you couldn't tell whether they were men or women. So that really speaks to how every facet, this implicit bias, is operating. And I wish I knew the remedy. I want to just say, why are we always trying to be more assertive? Why can't men try and be more like women and sit back and think, what would happen if everyone took a minute and just thought before they started asking questions? Not the first provocative thing they could think of to ask, but really took time to say, maybe some things would bubble up that need to be said.
But isn't that one of the big differences between men and women, right? Is that men don't think, or they react quickly and maybe they don't pause a minute to make sure they're saying the right thing or they're doing the right thing?
They are rewarded, I think, for fast. People, just in general, people are really rewarded for fast, being quick and also just this thing about having something different to set you apart is very much ingrained in the reward system.
That's also exactly what Lipton said in the 2018 article I was referring to. He said that when men fly off the handle, they're often regarded more highly than men who don't, and that an even temperament is more commonly thought as a feminine trait, which is quite interesting because as a woman, I feel like I would admire anyone with a more even temperament, but in the workplace, perhaps among other men, they prefer to see more assertiveness than not.
I also think there's a larger problem with the whole Q&A format for a session. First of all, there's not a lot of time allocated at the end. I also think that there should be a warning that people don't come to the microphone or ask a question and say, this is more a comment than a question, because I think that's where you start to hear people posturing rather than really trying to get more information to help them understand or help the rest of the audience understand. So maybe that is something that planners can do. Jen, do you have any thoughts?
This is Jen Dienst. I'm senior editor. I was just thinking about the role that technology can play here. I mean, certainly we've all been to meetings and seen the way that we've used our phones to submit questions and engage with a session or a speaker. And I'm just wondering, Are there any studies that kind of show that more questions are asked if technology is used? Does that kind of help level the playing field? Be interesting to kind of dig into that and see if that has helped, and if, I'm sure it makes people feel a little bit more open to asking questions if they're not having to get up and actually say it or walk to a microphone, which I think I know I would feel intimidated to ask their question or to engage with a speaker.
I think that if your identity wasn't revealed when you asked the question, they were all anonymous, then you would get more questions from women. But I think if your name is there and your affiliation, that is a little intimidating, I think, for women who are just so concerned about the way they're perceived by other people. And I'm also thinking about the imposter syndrome, Maggie, which you've written about. I just feel like there are a lot of us who feel like we are not really who we say we are. We just suffer from the imposter syndrome, thinking we're not good enough.
Well, that's not a only women's illness, if you want to call it that, syndrome.
I do think more women suffer from it than men, but I definitely know that there are men who also deal with that.
Right.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's a very good wrap, because we can keep on circling and trying to find a solution to this issue. And I just want to wrap up kind of in a sentence what Joe said. And you're surprised the next generation is here, but you're not seeing the change. We've sucked so much from the previous generations, and I think we'll need a couple of more generations to try to alleviate that problem, that issue, change it, and move past it, because we've suffered from imposter syndrome for, I don't know, many years, probably before it was called an imposter syndrome. So we'll keep on having it. And I just want to make reference to the first episode from the series. We have it all. We all suffer from imposter syndrome, but we do it anyway. And I think that's a testament also for this episode, us speaking up and trying to bring a bit of behind the scenes of how we pick stories for a News Junkie. So I just want to thank you all for this conversation, and we do this next week again.
If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to hear more, please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you would like additional perspectives on the industry, check out pcma.org/convene. Until next time.